Picture the busiest airport on the planet today. More runways than you can count from a plane window, more gates than some cities have streets, a river of travelers moving through it every single hour of every single day. Now picture something bigger, not slightly bigger, over 100 million passengers bigger every single year. That airport doesn't exist yet. But it's already under construction right now in a country most people wouldn't guess in 100 tries. It's not being built in Dubai, it's not in China, not in the United States, not anywhere near the busiest aviation markets you'd normally think of. It's rising out of the ground in Ethiopia, in a town called Bishoftu, about 45 kilometers southeast of Addis Ababa. And when it's finished, this single airport is designed to handle up to 110 million passengers a year. That's more than Heathrow, more than Dubai International, more than Istanbul, more even than Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, the airport that currently holds the title of busiest on Earth. A $12.5 billion project built from scratch in a country that a lot of people still associate with famine relief campaigns from decades ago rather than aviation superpower status. So how exactly is this happening, and can it actually work? Let's get into it. First, some context, because this project doesn't come out of nowhere. Africa right now has one of the fastest growing aviation markets anywhere in the world, and the numbers back that up in a pretty dramatic way. Between May 2025 and May 2026, airline capacity across the continent, essentially the number of available seats being flown, grew by almost 7%. Compare that to the same period in Southeast Asia, which grew under 2%, or Europe, which grew by around 2%, or the global average, which sat at roughly 1%. Africa's aviation growth isn't just outpacing everyone else, it's lapping them, and that growth is expected to keep compounding. Over the next 20 years, forecasts put Africa's aviation market growing at more than 4% a year, which, stacked up over 2 decades, adds up to hundreds of millions of additional passengers stepping onto planes who simply weren't flying before. Some of that comes down to a continent-wide push toward economic integration, a 50-year blueprint called Agenda 2063, aimed at transforming Africa into a genuine global economic powerhouse, partly by making it dramatically easier for Africans to travel across their own continent. Several countries have already started dropping visa requirements for fellow African citizens, echoing what Europe did decades ago with the Schengen area, and the early evidence from Europe suggests that kind of open border travel really does unlock demand that was sitting there all along, just waiting for the friction to disappear. But here's the problem. Right now, only around 19% of flight routes within Africa are direct. If you want to fly from one major African city to another, South America has São Paulo's Guarulhos, Asia has Dubai, Oceania has Sydney. Africa, despite being the second largest continent on Earth, doesn't really have one. Not yet. That's the gap Bishoftu is being built to fill. And it's worth pausing on just how strange that gap is, given the size of the continent involved. Africa is home to well over 1 billion people, spans a landmass big enough to swallow the United States, China, India, and most of Europe combined. And yet, if you wanted to fly between 2 African capitals on opposite sides of the continent today, there's a very real chance your fastest option involves flying north to Europe or east to the Gulf first. Airlines call that backtracking, and it's exactly the kind of inefficiency that a well-placed central hub is designed to eliminate. To understand why Ethiopia specifically is making this move, you have to look at what's already there. Ethiopia's current major hub, Addis Ababa Bole International, handles more than 20 million passengers a year, a genuinely impressive number for the country, roughly comparable to Budapest or Tampa. But Bole is running out of room, and fast. Officials expect it to hit full capacity within the next 2 to 3 years. And expanding it isn't really an option because Bole faces the exact same problem that airports in Sydney, Mumbai, and London all deal with. It's boxed in by the city that grew up around it. There's simply nowhere left to build. So instead of trying to squeeze more capacity out of a site that's already maxed out, Ethiopia made a much bigger bet. Build somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with enough open land to construct not just an airport, but essentially an airport-sized city. It's worth remembering, too, that Bole isn't some sleepy regional airport that suddenly found itself overwhelmed. It's already a genuinely major international gateway, connecting Addis Ababa to well over 100 destinations across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas through Ethiopian Airlines' extensive route network. The fact that an airport handling 20 million passengers a year is already bumping up against its ceiling tells you just how fast demand has been climbing, and how badly the region needs somewhere bigger to absorb the growth that's still coming. That's Bishoftu, the largest aviation infrastructure project in Africa's history, a claim that, given the scale involved, is hard to argue with. The design comes from Zaha Hadid Architects, the same firm behind some of the most striking sculptural infrastructure projects on the planet, and this isn't just a terminal building with some runways attached. It's being planned as a genuine airport city, Hotels, retail, office space, cargo processing facilities, all built around the actual flight operations at the center. That's become something of a trend in modern mega airport design because the smartest new hubs aren't just processing passengers anymore, they're capturing the economic activity that naturally clusters around a place where tens of millions of people pass through every year. The design team has also leaned into sustainability in ways that go beyond the usual box ticking. Plans call for stormwater collected across the runways, taxiways, and rooftops to be channeled into newly created wetlands for reuse, alongside photovoltaic arrays intended to generate power on site, taking advantage of the region's abundant sunshine and mild climate. Even the materials are being sourced with an eye towards sustainability, with procurement prioritizing concrete, aggregates, and steel produced or recycled locally rather than shipped in from overseas. The sheer physical footprint alone gives you a sense of the ambition. The site spans around 35 square kilometers, which needed to be cleared and leveled before any real construction could begin. For comparison, Heathrow's entire footprint is about 12 square kilometers. JFK in New York is roughly 21. Bishoftu, at full build-out, is going to dwarf both of them combined. Construction is happening in phases, which is a smart, if unglamorous way to tackle something this enormous. Phase 1 focuses on the essentials: passenger facilities, the airfield itself, cargo handling infrastructure, and the road and rail connections needed to actually get people to and from the site. That phase is targeting 60 million annual passengers and is expected to open around 2030. And even that first phase terminal is going to be massive, designed to cover roughly 660,000 square meters, which puts it in the same conversation as some of the largest single airport terminals ever conceived anywhere in the world. Once fully built out across all phases, Bishoftu is expected to feature 4 separate runways, all rated code 4E, meaning they're long enough and strong enough to handle the biggest commercial aircraft flying today. There will be parking for around 270 planes on the ground at once. And the full capacity figure, that eye-watering 110 million passengers a year, represents more than 4 times what Bol currently handles. The design itself leans heavily into Ethiopian identity, rather than just copying a generic template you'd see anywhere else in the world. The terminal facilities and boarding piers are connected through a central spine, deliberately inspired by the Great Rift Valley, the massive geological formation that cuts straight through the country near Bishoftu itself. That's not just an aesthetic flourish either. That central spine is meant to genuinely cut down on the walking distance passengers need to cover between gates, which matters enormously for an airport designed primarily around one specific job: connections. According to Ethiopian Airlines' own projections, roughly 80% of the people who land at Bishoftu won't actually be visiting Ethiopia at all. They'll be connecting onward to somewhere else entirely, using Bishoftu purely as a stopover between 2 other destinations, the same way huge numbers of travelers already use Dubai or Istanbul today without ever leaving the terminal. And then there's an advantage to the location that most people would never think to ask about: altitude. Bishoftu sits at around 1,900 meters above sea level, roughly 400 meters lower than Bole. You'd assume that doesn't matter much, but for aircraft performance, it actually matters a lot. Thinner air at higher altitudes makes it next to the eye-popping passenger numbers, but it might matter just as much strategically. Ethiopia is landlocked, which means virtually everything the country imports or exports by sea first has to travel overland to a port in a neighboring nation. Air cargo isn't a convenience for a country in that position. It's a genuine economic lifeline. Bishoftu is targeting around 4 million tons of cargo capacity a year, a figure that would place it among the 5 busiest cargo hubs anywhere on the planet, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Hong Kong, Memphis, and Shanghai. Combine that with Ethiopian Airlines already being one of the largest cargo carriers on the African continent, flying everything from fresh flowers to pharmaceuticals across multiple continents, and you start to see why this airport isn't just about tourists snapping photos of a striking new terminal. It's about turning Ethiopia into a genuine logistics choke point for trade moving between Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Now, who's actually paying for all of this? $12.5 billion is an enormous sum for any country to commit to a single piece of infrastructure, and Ethiopia's economy is nowhere near the size of the nations that usually bankroll projects like this. According to reporting around the January groundbreaking, Ethiopian Airlines itself is funding roughly 30% of the total cost directly, with the remainder coming through external lenders, a financing structure that notably keeps the burden off Ethiopian taxpayers directly, even if it does mean the airline and the country are taking on significant debt to make this happen. But no infrastructure project this size comes without real controversy, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. It's worth remembering that the airline behind this project isn't some fledgling regional carrier either. The hub strategy stretching into Togo, Malawi, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's pursuing a long-term strategic plan, aiming to place it among the 20 most competitive aviation groups anywhere in the world. Bishoftu isn't a bet from a standing start. It's the biggest chip a very experienced player is pushing onto the table, backed by an airline that has spent the better part of 2 decades quietly building the route network this new hub will need in order to actually work. Building an airport city across 35 square kilometers of land, though, means displacing people who were living and farming there. Ethiopian Airlines has stated that resettlement and livelihood restoration for the affected communities has now been completed, and that displaced farmers have been given new housing as part of the process. That's the official position, and it's a meaningful commitment if it holds up in practice. Large infrastructure projects across the world, though, have a long history of promising smooth resettlement on paper that turns out to be messier and slower once you talk to the actual families involved. Delayed payments, disputes over compensation values, communities who feel like they were moved rather than consulted. Whether Bishoftu becomes a rare example of a megaproject that genuinely got resettlement right will likely only become clear over the next few years, as the people who used to live on that land settle into their new circumstances. There's also the simple, honest question of whether the demand will actually be there. 110 million passengers a year is an enormous target, and Bishoftu will be competing directly with hubs that have decades of head starts. Dubai, Istanbul, Doha, all firmly established as the connection points between Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, each backed by state-owned carriers with enormous fleets and marketing budgets to match. Dubai International alone has spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating exactly the kind of connecting traffic Bishoftu now hopes to capture, and Istanbul's newer airport was purpose-built with almost identical ambitions in mind. Ethiopia isn't just building infrastructure here. It's asking millions of travelers to change habits that, for some routes, have been in place for a generation. Even within Africa itself, Bishoftu isn't the only ambitious project chasing this kind of growth. Egypt is working on doubling the capacity of Cairo International, currently the continent's busiest airport, aiming to eventually push it toward 60 million passengers a year. That's still well short of Bishoftu's ultimate ambitions, but it's a reminder that Ethiopia isn't operating in a vacuum. There's real regional competition for the title of Africa's aviation gateway, and more than one country on the continent clearly sees the same opportunity Ethiopia does. And then there's the funding gap itself. While Ethiopian Airlines has committed to covering a meaningful slice of the bill, a large portion of the remaining financing still needs to be locked down through international lenders, with reported talks involving the United States and China, among others. Closing multi-billion-dollar financing agreements is never simple, and it's not unheard of for major infrastructure projects to break ground on optimism before every dollar is actually secured. That's not necessarily a red flag on its own. Plenty of transformative projects have started construction while financing details were still being finalized in parallel. But it does mean Bishoftu's ultimate scale isn't fully guaranteed until those agreements are signed, sealed, and delivered. Still, it's hard to dismiss the underlying logic here because the opportunity Ethiopia is chasing is real. Airlines and airports thrive on the concept of connections. A traveler flying from, say, Lagos to Nairobi doesn't need to route through Europe or the Gulf if there's a faster, cheaper, more convenient African alternative sitting geographically in between. That logic ties directly into the African Continental Free Trade Area, an agreement now spanning more than 50 countries designed to cut tariffs, streamline trade, and deepen relationships between economies that, historically, have often traded more with Europe and Asia than with each other. A functioning continental aviation hub isn't just a nice-to-have for a project like that. It's practically a prerequisite. Goods, business travelers, and tourists all need a way to move efficiently between African markets. And right now, that infrastructure gap is one of the quiet obstacles holding back intra-African trade growth. Ethiopian Airlines already has the route network and the brand recognition to make that pitch credibly. What it hasn't had, until now, is a hub genuinely built for that scale of ambition. Bol was never designed to be the connecting engine for an entire continent. Bishoftu is being built from a blank sheet of paper, specifically to be exactly that. No legacy infrastructure to work around, no decades-old terminal layout constraining the design, just a purpose-built mega-hub shaped entirely around the job it's meant to do. There's something almost symbolic about that, too. This is a bespoke project in the truest sense. Not an old airport patched together over 50 years of incremental expansions, the way most of the world's busiest hubs actually look under the hood, but a single coherent vision, built once, built big, and built with the next several decades of African air travel growth already baked into the blueprint. So where does this leave things? Construction on the first phase is underway now, with land clearance targeted for completion by the end of this year in that first phase, the 60 million passenger version of Bishoftu, expected to open its doors around 2030. Beyond that, plans call for additional runways, a second passenger terminal, and even a 38-kilometer rail line connecting the new airport directly back to Addis Ababa, tying the whole project into the country's wider transport network, rather than leaving it stranded on its own out on the plains. Whether Bishoftu ultimately hits that staggering 110 million passenger figure is something only time, and a lot of very expensive financing agreements will answer. But the ambition itself tells you something important about where global aviation growth is actually headed next. For decades, the story of mega airports has been a story about the Gulf and about Asia, Dubai, Doha, Istanbul, Singapore, all racing to build bigger, flashier hubs to capture connecting traffic between distant continents. Africa was rarely part of that conversation, treated more as a market to be served from elsewhere than a place capable of building its own gateway. Bishoftu is Ethiopia's attempt to rewrite that assumption entirely, betting $12.5 billion that the next great crossroads of global travel doesn't have to be somewhere else. It can be right here on African soil, built by an African airline, for a continent that's finally ready to fly on its own terms. And unlike a lot of the mega projects we cover on this channel, this one doesn't have the luxury of retrofitting decades of legacy infrastructure. It's being designed from the ground up, runway by runway, wetland by wetland, around a single, very specific bet that if you build the connection, the passengers will eventually come. If Bishoftu comes anywhere close to delivering on what's been promised, air travel across an entire continent could look completely different within the decade. And if you want to see exactly how that story unfolds, subscribe, because we'll be tracking every phase of it as it happens.